My parents gave my brother $90,000 for his business and told me, "You don't deserve help. My name is Eden Brooks, and I am 28 years old." The words that broke me were not yelled. They were spoken calmly, over the clink of silverware on my mother's best china. It was a Sunday, which in our house meant a formal family dinner, even if it was just the four of us. The late afternoon sun slanted through the dining room's bay window, illuminating the million tiny dust motes dancing in the air and glinting off the crystal water glasses. The room smelled of roasted chicken and my father's self-satisfaction. It was a perfect, peaceful family scene, an illusion I had long stopped believing in. My father paused, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin, and slid a thick manila envelope across the polished mahogany. It moved with a quiet, heavy friction, coming to a stop directly in front of my brother. "Nolan!" It was thick enough to be obscene. "Here you go, son," my father said, his voice brimming with a pride he reserved only for Nolan. 90,000, just like we promised. "For the new business?" Nolan smiled, his easy, confident grin that always seemed to say he'd expected nothing less. He picked up the envelope, bouncing its weight in his palm. "Thanks, Dad. This will get things off the ground." My mother beamed at him, her eyes sparkling. "We know you'll make us proud, dear." A familiar knot tightened in my stomach. I took a breath. My own dream felt so small in comparison, but I had to try. "Dad!" I started, my voice sounding thin. "I was wondering, there's an online design course I want to take. It's a few $100s. I was thinking maybe I could borrow—" My father laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was a sharp, percussive sound of disbelief that cut right through me. "Eden, Eden, Eden," he said, shaking his head. "Always with the little projects." My mother placed a cool hand on his arm. "You've always been a dreamer, Eden," she said, her voice like ice. "Be grateful we're honest with you. Some things just aren't meant to be." Nolan smirked, tapping the thick envelope on the table. "Yeah, Eden. Try not to embarrass us with your little projects." In that moment, their three faces blurred into one single expression of dismissal. I finally understood. In their eyes, he was worth a $90,000 gamble. I wasn't even worth a conversation. I was not the investment. I was the expense. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, drop a comment, and let me know where you are watching from. To understand the silence that fell over that dinner table, you have to understand the silence that was my entire life. My family operated on an unspoken system, a hierarchy as rigid and polished as the dining room table itself. At the head of it all sat my father, the patriarch. Beside him, my mother, the enforcer of his vision. And at their right hand, always, was my brother, Nolan. He was the heir, the golden boy, the future CEO, since he was old enough to wear a tiny suit for a family photo. And I was Eden. I was the footnotes, the appendix, the quiet space at the bottom of the page that nobody reads. I was the invisible daughter. My role was defined early. I was the fixer. I didn't break things. I made them whole again. I remember being about 9 years old, the night before Nolan's big California mission project was due. He was supposed to build a model of Mission San Juan Capistrano. He'd left it until the last minute, of course, and his attempt was a disaster of dripping glue and crooked cardboard walls. Around 10 o'clock at night, he threw a fit, kicked the table, and the whole mess collapsed. He screamed that it was stupid and went to his room to play video games. My mother sighed. My father grumbled about his lack of focus, and then they both looked at me. "Eden, honey, could you just help him a little?" My mother asked. Helping meant I stayed up until 2 in the morning, my small fingers meticulously cutting tiny roof tiles out of construction paper. I used my own allowance money I'd saved to buy better glue and little plastic mission bells from the craft store. I rebuilt the entire thing carefully, quietly, while the rest of the house was asleep. The next morning, Nolan took it to school without so much as a thank you. He came home with an A+. My parents praised him at dinner. "See, Nolan? When you put your mind to it, you can do anything," my father said, ruffling his hair. Nolan just grinned. No one mentioned my name. My only reward was the leftover glue stuck to my fingers and a deep, aching tiredness in my bones. That was the pattern. I was the support system, the unseen infrastructure that made Nolan's life run smoothly. In high school, he was the popular athlete, and I was the studious girl in the art room. He got attention for scoring a touchdown. I got a polite nod for winning a statewide art competition. His trophy went on the main mantelpiece in the living room. My framed certificate was hung in the upstairs hallway near the linen closet. When I was 16, I got a job bussing tables at a local diner so I could save for a car. My parents called it character building. They said I was learning the value of $1. When Nolan turned 16, they bought him a brand new Jeep. They said it was to give him a sense of responsibility. The ultimate test of this system came the year he crashed my father's Lexus. He was 17, out past curfew with his friends, and he'd been drinking. The call came late at night. I woke up to the sound of my parents' frantic, hushed voices. I crept out of my room and saw my father's face, pale and grim. My mother was crying, but they weren't crying because he could have been hurt or hurt someone else. They were crying because of the trouble he was in. The next few weeks were a blur of hushed phone calls and meetings with a lawyer whose fees probably could have paid for my entire college education. Nolan was grounded for a month, which meant he just had his friends come over to our house instead. There was no real punishment. The entire incident was scrubbed away with money and influence. 2 weeks after the lawyer made it all disappear, my father co-signed a loan for Nolan to get his own car. I found them looking at brochures at the kitchen table. I couldn't hold my tongue. He just crashed a car, I said, my voice trembling slightly. He was drinking. Why would you give him another one? My father looked at me, his expression unreadable. He made a mistake, Eden, a stupid one. But the boy needs to know that we believe in him, that we have his back. That's what a family does. That's what a family does for him, I thought. I had to follow a strict curfew. My parents checked the mileage on my old Honda to make sure I was only going to work and back. I was the one they watched, the one they managed. He was the one they believed in. His belief-fueled journey continued. He went off to a prestigious business school that cost a fortune. I went to a state university on a partial art scholarship, working 20 hours a week to cover the rest. I'd call home, excited to tell them I'd made the dean's list, and the conversation would inevitably turn to Nolan. That's wonderful, dear, my mother would say, her voice distant. Did we tell you Nolan is thinking of starting an investment club in his dorm? He has such a mind for these things. He dropped out of that expensive school after 2 years. He said the professors were stifling his creativity. My parents accepted this without question. They gave him $10,000 to start his first business, a subscription service for gourmet organic dog treats. He spent months developing it in our kitchen. The whole house smelled like burnt peanut butter and liver. He roped me into designing his logo and website for free. The business folded in 6 months. The dogs, it turned out, preferred the cheap stuff. My parents called it a valuable learning experience. Next was a mobile app for finding parking spots. It was a good idea in theory, but Nolan had no idea how to code, and he hired the wrong people. $20,000 of my father's money vanished into a non-functioning prototype. Another learning experience. With every failure, their investment in him grew. It was as if they were determined to pour money into the hole he was digging until somehow it turned into a gold mine. Meanwhile, I graduated with honors. I got a stable job as an administrative assistant. I paid my own rent, my own bills. I was responsible. I was reliable. I was humble. I was everything they claimed they wanted me to be. But I was learning a bitter lesson. In my family, reliability wasn't rewarded. It was just expected. It made you part of the background, as dependable and unnoticeable as the plumbing. Ambition was what got you noticed, but only a certain kind of ambition. Nolan's loud, expensive, and ultimately fruitless ambition was celebrated. My quiet, careful, and self-funded ambition was a little project. For years, I told myself this was normal. Every family has its dynamics. I told myself I didn't want the pressure that was on Nolan. I told myself I preferred my quiet, independent life. I made peace with being the daughter who never asked for anything, because I knew I would never get it. I learned to parent myself, to be my own cheerleader, to fund my own dreams. But that day, at that table, the lie I had been telling myself fell apart. Watching that envelope slide across the table was like watching all the love, support, and belief I had ever craved get handed to the one person who had never earned it and would never appreciate it. And being laughed at for asking for a fraction of that support wasn't just an insult. It was a final verdict. After 28 years of fixing, of trying, of being the good daughter, the message was clear. My efforts meant nothing. I meant nothing. The invisible daughter had finally completely disappeared. The rest of that dinner was a special kind of torture. After the laughter died down, a thick, uncomfortable silence took its place. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for me to cry or to argue or to storm away from the table. I did none of those things. I simply picked up my fork and pushed a piece of roasted potato around my plate. The food, which minutes before had smelled delicious, now tasted like ash in my mouth. My throat was so tight I wasn't sure I could swallow anyway. Nolan, of course, was oblivious. Or maybe he just didn't care. He was already talking about his business plans, his voice booming with unearned confidence. He spoke about marketing strategies and growth potential, using buzzwords he'd probably learned from a podcast. My father leaned in, hanging on every word, nodding and asking intelligent-sounding questions. My mother watched Nolan with a look of pure adoration, as if he were a genius painting a masterpiece instead of a serial failure planning his next expensive mistake. I was a ghost at my own family dinner. I sat there physically present, but my mind was miles away. I was replaying the moment over and over again. My father's laugh, my mother's icy words, Nolan's smirk. It was a three-part harmony of dismissal that echoed in my head. I felt a hot, prickling shame creep up my neck. I had been so stupid to ask, so naive. After all these years, why did I still think this time would be different? Why did I still hold out a tiny, pathetic hope that they might finally see me? Eden, you've barely touched your food, my mother said. Her voice wasn't kind or concerned. It was accusatory, as if my lack of appetite was a personal offense to her. I'm not very hungry, I mumbled, keeping my eyes fixed on my plate. Well, you should eat. You're too thin, she said, ending the conversation. It was her way of showing care, a criticism disguised as concern. When dinner was finally over, I practically fled the room. I offered to help with the dishes, a lifelong habit, but my mother waved me away. No, you go on upstairs. Nolan and I will handle it. It was another small cut, another way of saying, we don't need you. I walked up the carpeted stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house was so familiar, the scent of my mother's potpourri, the tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall. But tonight it felt like a stranger's home where I was an unwelcome guest. I went to my childhood bedroom and closed the door, leaning my forehead against the cool wood. I just stood there breathing. I didn't want to be in that room, with its memories of a girl who tried so hard to be perfect, thinking that perfection would earn her love. I needed to move. I decided to go down to the kitchen for a glass of water, an excuse to be anywhere else. As I padded down the hallway in my socks, I passed my parents' bedroom. The door was ajar, and a slice of light fell across the dark hallway carpet. I heard their voices. I should have kept walking. A part of me, the part that had learned to survive in this house, screamed at me to keep going. But I was frozen. The pain from dinner was a raw, open wound, and I had a morbid need to know if they were going to pour salt in it. I held my breath and listened. She's so dramatic, my mother said. Her voice was sharp, stripped of any pretense of motherly softness. Did you see her face at dinner? You'd think we'd committed a crime. She's sensitive, my father grumbled. He said the word sensitive like it was a disease. She gets that from your side of the family. She doesn't have a practical bone in her body. Fashion design. For God's sake. It's a fool's dream. It's not even a good dream for her, my mother added, and her next words were like a physical blow. That blouse she was wearing tonight, the one she made? It was so homemade. You could see the stitches in the collar were uneven if you looked closely. It pulled across the shoulders. She doesn't even have an eye for it. She just thinks she does. I instinctively wrapped my arms around myself, feeling a flush of shame so intense it made me dizzy. I had been so proud of that blouse. I had chosen the fabric carefully, a soft cotton that felt like a whisper against the skin. I'd spent hours on the collar trying to get it just right, and she had dissected it with the cold precision of a surgeon, finding every tiny flaw. She's just not like Nolan, my father continued, his voice heavy with disappointment. Nolan sees the world as it is. He's a fighter. He's got that killer instinct. Eden, she just floats. She doesn't have any drive. We're doing the right thing by not encouraging this. It would be cruel to let her think she could actually succeed. I know, my mother said with a sigh. We have to protect her from herself. Better she sticks to that little admin job. It's safe. It's stable. She can handle that. Protect me. From myself. They weren't just withholding support. They were actively working against my confidence, my ambition, my very sense of self. They had built a narrative for me, the sensitive, impractical dreamer who needed to be protected, and they were trimming away any part of me that didn't fit that story. Their words weren't just an opinion, they were a verdict. They had judged me, found me lacking, and sentenced me to a small, safe life I didn't want. I couldn't hear anymore. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I stumbled back to my room, closing the door so softly it didn't even click. I sank to the floor in the darkness, the floral wallpaper of my childhood seeming to mock me. This was my cage, a pretty, comfortable cage where I would never be allowed to fly. The tears came then, hot and silent. I pressed my fist against my mouth to stifle the sobs. I had cried in this room so many times over the years, over a mean comment from Nolan, a forgotten birthday, a dismissed achievement. But this was different. Those were tears of hurt. These were tears of grief. I was grieving the family I wished I had, the parents I desperately wanted them to be. I was grieving the girl who had spent her entire life trying to win an unwinnable game. After what felt like hours, the tears ran out. I was left with a hollow, empty feeling. I crawled across the floor to my desk and pulled out my old black sketchbook. The cover was soft and worn from years of use. It was the one place where I was not invisible. It was filled with my real self. I opened it, flipping through the pages in the dim moonlight filtering through my window. There were dozens of designs, each one a secret hope. A flowing dress for a summer party I'd never be invited to. A sharp, tailored suit that made me feel powerful. A simple, elegant trench coat that was timeless. These weren't just drawings. They were pieces of my soul. I stopped on a new page and picked up a pencil. My hand was shaking, but I started to sketch. I drew a woman. She was standing tall, her face turned toward the light. She was wearing a coat of my design, the lines clean and strong, unflinching. I leaned my head against the cold window pane, the sketchbook held tight to my chest like a shield. They were just downstairs, probably sleeping peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were being good parents. They had no idea they had just destroyed their daughter. Or maybe they had just created a new one. I whispered the words into the silence of the room. A vow made only to myself. You'll see me someday. It wasn't a plea for their attention anymore. It was a warning. The week that followed that dinner was one of the strangest of my life. I lived in my parents' house like a polite ghost. I went to my job, came home, ate the dinners my mother placed in front of me, and answered their questions with single empty words. I built a wall of quiet civility around myself, and they seemed relieved by it. They likely interpreted my silence as acceptance, as me finally understanding my place. They had no idea that behind my blank expression, a revolution was taking place. During my lunch breaks at work, I wasn't eating. I was on my phone, scrolling through apartment listings in parts of the city I barely knew. I was looking for something small, something cheap, something far away from the manicured lawns and quiet judgment of my parents' neighborhood. The process was terrifying. I had never lived completely on my own. My first apartment after college had been co-signed by my father, a safety net I had always resented but relied on. This time there would be no safety net. I found it on a Tuesday. A studio apartment above a 24-hour laundromat in a loud, busy neighborhood called Westmore. The listing had 3 blurry photos and a short description. Cozy studio. Utilities not included? No pets. It was perfect. I called the number and arranged to see it that evening, lying to my parents that I was working late. The landlord was a tired-looking man named Sal, who seemed perpetually unimpressed. He let me into the apartment, which was up a narrow, steep flight of stairs next to the laundromat entrance. The air smelled of bleach and warm linen. The apartment itself was exactly as advertised. A small box, 1 main room, a tiny bathroom with a stained shower, and a kitchenette that was little more than a sink and a hot plate. The walls were a dingy yellow, and one of the windows had a crack held together with tape. It was small and sad and a little bit broken. It felt like me. Rent's due on the 1st. Don't be late, Sal said, handing me an application. I filled it out in my car, using my savings account as proof of funds. I gave it back to him with a deposit in cash, money I had painstakingly saved from years of working. The whole transaction felt illicit and exciting. When he called me the next day to say the apartment was mine, my heart hammered against my ribs with a mixture of pure terror and exhilarating freedom. The following Saturday, while my parents were at their weekly golf game and Nolan was out with his fiancée, I executed my plan. I had been secretly packing for days, hiding boxes in the back of my closet. I didn't take much. I left behind the furniture, the photos, the trinkets of a life that no longer felt like mine. I packed my clothes, my books, and most importantly, my sewing supplies and sketchbooks. I loaded everything into my beat-up Honda. The car's suspension groaned under the weight. Before I left, I walked through the silent house one last time. I stood in the doorway of the dining room, looking at the long, polished table where my life had been irrevocably altered. It was just a piece of furniture, but it felt like a monument to my family's blindness. I didn't feel sad. I just felt done. I wrote a short, simple note and left it in the center of the table. I've moved out. I'll be in touch. No explanation, no anger, no emotion. Just a fact. The drive to my new apartment felt like an escape. When I arrived, I had to park 2 blocks away. I carried my boxes up the narrow staircase, my muscles straining. The last and most important thing I brought up was my sketchbook. I unlocked the door, my door, with a key that was solely mine. I stepped inside and dropped my bags. The room was empty and filled with the dusty afternoon light. I stood in the middle of the floor, breathing in the smell of old paint. The distant hum of washing machines from downstairs was a comforting, constant drone. This was the sound of my new life. I had never felt so alone, and I had never felt so free. There was no one here to impress, no one to disappoint. The only expectations in this room were my own. That night, I didn't even unpack. I ordered a cheap pizza from the place across the street and ate it sitting on the floor, using a cardboard box as a table. Then I unrolled a sleeping bag and fell into the most peaceful sleep I'd had in a decade. The reality of my decision set in on Monday morning. Freedom was not free. It was expensive and exhausting. My administrative job barely covered my rent and bills. I needed more money. So I built a life of relentless work. I found a job at a small coffee shop that opened at 5:30 a.m. I would wake up at 4, walk to the shop in the dark, and spend the next 7 hours brewing coffee, steaming milk, and forcing a smile for sleepy, grumpy customers. The work was repetitive and draining, but it was honest. After my shift ended, I didn't go home to rest. I'd change in the coffee shop bathroom and start my second job as a delivery driver for a food app. I spent my afternoons and evenings navigating city traffic, carrying bags of food that smelled so much better than the instant noodles I'd be eating for dinner. I saw the insides of fancy apartment buildings and sprawling suburban homes, little glimpses into lives that seemed so much easier than mine. There were nights when the exhaustion was so complete it felt like a physical illness. I remember one rainy Tuesday. I was sitting in my car, the food delivery bag fogging up the passenger seat. My back ached, my clothes were damp, and I hadn't eaten a real meal all day. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother. Haven't heard from you. Hope you're okay. I almost broke. It would have been so easy to text back, I'm not okay. I made a mistake. Can I come home? I closed my eyes, and my father's voice filled my head, as clear as if he were sitting next to me. You don't deserve help. He had meant it as a judgment, a final word on my worth. But in that moment in my cold, damp car, the words transformed. They weren't a curse. They were a challenge, an instruction. Don't ask for help. Don't wait for help. Help yourself. Anger, cold and clear, washed away the exhaustion. It straightened my spine. I put the car in drive and headed back to my apartment. I didn't go to sleep. I made a pot of the cheapest, strongest coffee I could find, sat down at my rickety table with my laptop, and paid the enrollment fee for the online fashion program. The confirmation email felt like a victory. My life found its rhythm. Work, deliver, study. In the precious stolen hours between midnight and 3 a.m., the city was quiet, and my apartment became my sanctuary, my school, my workshop. I bought a secondhand sewing machine from a pawn shop and taught myself to use it by watching online videos. I practiced on old bed sheets and curtains I bought from the thrift store. My first attempts were clumsy. My stitches were crooked, but with every seam I ripped and re-sewed, I felt something healing inside me. I wasn't just stitching fabric together. I was stitching myself back together. I was building something, not for their approval, but for my own survival. And it was all being powered by the 4 words they thought would break me. The next 2 years were a blur. My world shrank to the size of my tiny apartment, the coffee shop, and the front seat of my Honda. I lived a life of deliberate obscurity, building my future in the shadows while the rest of the world, including my family, remained completely unaware. My existence was a grueling routine of steam wands, traffic jams, and the late-night hum of my sewing machine. It was a lonely time, but it wasn't a sad time. It was focused. Every moment of exhaustion, every dollar I saved, was an investment in a future that was mine alone. My apartment slowly transformed from a living space into a workshop. The small table where I ate was perpetually covered in fabric swatches and half-finished patterns. My closet was crammed with bolts of fabric I'd found in thrift store bins, and my bathtub was often stained with dye from my experiments with natural colors. I learned to be resourceful out of necessity. I couldn't afford expensive materials, so I learned the art of transformation. I could see the potential in a discarded linen curtain or an old wool blanket. I would carefully take them apart, wash them, dye them, and give them new life as a blouse or a pair of trousers. My design philosophy was born from these limitations. Simple, sustainable, and timeless. I made clothes that were meant to be lived in, not just looked at. They were quiet like me, but they were strong. Creating an online presence was a whole new struggle. I was not a marketer. I was shy and hated the idea of self-promotion, but I knew no one else was going to do it for me. I spent my nights after my design course lectures watching tutorials on brand building, social media marketing, and basic photography. I created an Instagram account and an Etsy shop. I needed a name. For days I wrestled with it. I didn't want anything flashy. I wanted something that spoke to the craft. Finally, I landed on Brooks and Thread. Using my own last name felt like a quiet act of rebellion. It was the name they had given me, but I would be the one to define what it meant. Taking photos of my creations was a weekly challenge. I had no mannequin, no fancy camera. My model was me. I would use my phone's self-timer, propping it up on a stack of books. I'd hang a white sheet over my cracked window for a clean background and try to capture the way the fabric moved, the detail in a seam. My first posts were clumsy and amateurish. They got a few likes, mostly from strangers. But I kept at it, refining my technique with every piece I made. Then, one day, it happened. I got a notification. You've made a sale. My heart stopped. I stared at my phone screen in disbelief. A woman in Ohio had paid $40 for a simple linen shirt I had made. It felt more real and more valuable than any paycheck I had ever received. I packed that shirt with the care of a museum curator, wrapping it in tissue paper and writing a thank you note by hand. Walking to the post office to mail that first package felt like a monumental achievement. I had created something and someone else in the world valued it enough to pay for it. It was proof. I was not just a dreamer with crooked seams. I was a maker. That first sale was a crack of light in the darkness. It was followed by another a few weeks later, then another. I started getting comments from people asking about my process, about the fabrics I used. A small community began to form around my work. People were drawn to the story behind the clothes, the sustainability, the handmade quality. Throughout this entire period, my communication with my family was minimal and superficial. My mother would call every few weeks. The conversations were always the same. "Hello, Eden. How are you?" "I'm good, Mom. Busy with work." "Are you eating properly? You always work too hard." "Yes, Mom. I'm fine." She never asked what work. She never asked where I was living or if I was happy. It was a conversation of checkboxes, designed to soothe her conscience without requiring any actual engagement. I think on some level they were waiting for me to fail. They were waiting for the call where I would admit I couldn't make it on my own and that they had been right all along. Giving them no information was my greatest defense. My silence was a fortress. About a year and a half after I had moved out, an embossed invitation arrived at my P.O. box. Nolan was getting engaged. The party was to be held at an expensive downtown restaurant. My first instinct was to throw it away. The thought of being in that room with all of them, of playing the part of the happy, supportive sister, made my stomach turn. But then I reconsidered. Hiding would be letting them win. It would confirm their narrative that I was too sensitive, that I couldn't handle things. I would go, but I would go as myself. I decided to make a new dress for the occasion. It was my secret weapon. I found a beautiful deep green silk at a fabric outlet. It was more expensive than I could really afford, but I bought it anyway. For a week, I poured all my energy and skill into that dress. I drafted the pattern myself. Every stitch was perfect. Every seam was pressed flat. It was a simple sheath dress, unadorned, but the cut and the fabric made it elegant. When I put it on, I felt transformed. It was a suit of armor made of silk. Walking into that restaurant was like walking into the past. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the sound of loud, confident laughter. I saw my parents holding court, my father telling some booming story to a group of men in suits. My mother, elegant and poised, smiled beside him. And then I saw Nolan, looking smug and successful, his arm wrapped possessively around his pretty blonde fiancée. My mother spotted me and her smile faltered for a second. "Eden, you came?" She looked me up and down, her eyes scanning my dress, looking for a flaw. "That's a lovely color on you," was all she said. I was seated at a table in the back with some little-known relatives. I was once again on the margins, an afterthought. I didn't mind. It gave me a perfect vantage point to observe. At one point, Nolan gave a speech, champagne glass in hand. He talked about his new tech startup, about disrupting the industry and blue sky thinking, the same old script. My father watched him with tears in his eyes. Nolan caught my eye from across the room and gave me a condescending little smile. Later, he came over to my table. "Hey, sis," he said, leaning down. "Surprised you could get a night off from your little job. Everything good?" The question was laced with pity. He thought I was still just a struggling admin, living some small, sad life. "Everything's great, Nolan," I said, my voice even and calm. "Congratulations!" He patted my shoulder and moved on, his duty to the poor sister done. I sat there, nursing a glass of water, feeling the familiar sting of their collective condescension. I was invisible to them, a failure by their standards. Just then, my purse vibrated. I slipped my phone out under the tablecloth, shielding the screen from view. It was an email notification from my online store. The subject line made my breath catch in my throat. "Congratulations. You've received an international order from London, UK." I clicked it open. Someone in London had just purchased one of my wool coats, my most expensive item. It was an order for over $300. It was more money than I had ever made in a single sale. It was real. It was happening. Someone an ocean away, someone who knew nothing about me or my family, had seen my work and decided it was valuable. I looked up from my phone. Nolan was laughing, the center of attention. My parents were glowing with pride for their successful son. They were all celebrating a fantasy, a business built on my father's money and Nolan's ego. They were toasting a lie. And in my lap, on the small bright screen of my phone, was my truth. A quiet, hard-earned international victory. I took a slow sip of my water and allowed myself a small, secret smile. They couldn't see me, but the rest of the world was starting to. The international order from London was not a fluke. It was the first raindrop before a storm. A few weeks later, a popular fashion blogger with a modest but loyal following bought one of my simple linen shirts. She posted a photo of herself wearing it, writing a short paragraph about the beauty of sustainable handmade clothing. She tagged Brooks and Thread. My phone buzzed with a few dozen new followers that day. I felt a thrill of excitement. It was a small step, but it was forward motion. I sent her a personal message thanking her for her support. It felt like I was making a connection, building something real. The real earthquake happened on a Thursday. I was at the coffee shop on my hands and knees, scrubbing a stubborn syrup spill from the floor. It was a particularly grueling morning, and my back was aching. My phone, which I kept in my back pocket, began to vibrate. It didn't stop. It buzzed and buzzed, a frantic, insistent rhythm against my leg. I figured it was a glitch, maybe a system error. During my 15-minute break, I finally pulled it out, annoyed. My screen was a cascade of notifications. Instagram, my Etsy shop, my email. It was a digital avalanche. My heart started to pound. I scrolled through the alerts, my hands shaking so badly I could barely read them. They were all for the same item. A simple, unlined wool jacket I had made from a repurposed blanket. It was a classic minimalist design with a single button and 2 deep pockets. I had made exactly one. Then I saw it. A tag on a photo from an account I didn't recognize. I clicked on it. The photo was of Amelia Vance, not just an actress, but one of the biggest stars in the world, famous for her talent, her activism, and her impeccable, understated style. The photo was a paparazzi shot. She was walking down a street in New York, holding a cup of coffee, looking effortlessly chic. And she was wearing my jacket. My $30 pawn shop sewing machine, repurposed blanket jacket was being worn by a movie star. A well-known fashion account had reposted the picture asking, "Who made this perfect coat?" And someone in the comments, one of my few early followers, had tagged Brooks and Thread. That was it. The floodgates opened. In a single hour, my Instagram followers went from a few hundred to over 10,000. My Etsy shop, with its handful of listings, sold out completely. I had over 200 messages from people begging to pre-order the jacket. Emails poured in from boutiques, from stylists, from bloggers I had only dreamed of knowing my name. My little secret project had just stepped onto a global stage, and I was still on my knees on a sticky coffee shop floor. I felt dizzy, a strange mix of euphoria and sheer terror. I finished my shift in a daze. I don't know how I made it through the rest of the day. I went to my delivery job and drove around the city on autopilot, my mind racing. This was it. This was the moment that could change everything. But it was happening too fast. I was just one person in a tiny apartment. I couldn't possibly meet this demand. The fear of failure was suffocating. What if this one lucky break just ended up proving my parents right? That I was a dreamer who couldn't handle the real world? That night, back in my workshop apartment, I looked at the chaos of my life. The single sewing machine, the piles of fabric, the hundreds of emails I had no idea how to answer. I could shut it all down. I could refund the orders and post a message saying I was a small artist who couldn't keep up. I could shrink back into the shadows. Then I heard my father's voice in my head. She doesn't have the drive. A new feeling pushed past the fear. Anger. Cold, determined anger. I would not shrink. I would not fail. I sat down and started to work. I stayed up for 2 days straight. I answered every email, politely explaining that I was a small batch designer and that wait times would be long. I set up a proper website with a pre-order system. I hired a virtual assistant with the last of my savings to help me manage the communications. I found a local fabric supplier who specialized in sustainable wool and bought as much as I could afford. My life changed overnight. I quit the coffee shop. I quit the delivery job. My only job now was Brooks and Thread. The next few months were the hardest of my life. I barely slept. I worked 18-hour days, cutting patterns on my floor, sewing until my fingers were raw. I made mistakes. I messed up orders. I cried from exhaustion and stress. But I never stopped. After 3 months, I had enough money to take the next step. I rented a small industrial studio space in an old warehouse district. It was twice the size of my apartment, with high ceilings and big windows that flooded the room with light. The day I moved my sewing machine into that empty space, I felt a sense of pride so profound it almost brought me to my knees. This was real. I had built this. I knew I couldn't do it alone anymore. Hiring my first employee was terrifying. Her name was Maria, a woman who had worked as a seamstress for 20 years before the factory she worked at shut down. She was quiet, professional, and her hands moved with a skill and confidence I could only dream of. I hired a second person, a young college student named Ben, to manage shipping and customer service. We were a small, strange team, but we worked. The studio was filled with the sounds of sewing machines, the chatter of my small staff, and the constant taping of shipping boxes. Success kept coming. We were featured on more blogs. We got a small write-up in a popular online fashion magazine. The praise was always for the same things: the quality of the craftsmanship, the sustainable ethos, the the timeless design. Then came the offer that changed everything. A high-end independent boutique with stores in 5 major cities wanted to become our first retail partner. They wanted to carry an exclusive collection from Brooks & Thread. The day I signed that contract, I felt a shift in the universe. This wasn't just a lucky break anymore. This was a business. A profitable, growing, successful business. And through it all, I said nothing to my family. The silence, which had once been a wall to protect me from their judgment, now became something else. It became my crown. My success was my own secret kingdom, a world they had no part in, a world they couldn't touch or tarnish with their opinions. My mother would call, and I'd be in the middle of a frantic day at the studio, overseeing a huge shipment for our retail partner. "What are you up to today, dear?" she'd ask, her voice laced with that familiar mild pity. "Oh, just working," I'd say calmly, as Maria passed me a stack of invoices to sign. The usual. The lie was exhilarating. It was my power. They had built their world around a story where Nolan was the sun and I was a distant fading star. They had no idea I had built my own galaxy, bright and burning and entirely out of their view. Let them have their story. I was busy living in mine. The news of Nolan's downfall didn't come to me in a dramatic phone call. It came the way most news did in my estranged life, indirectly, like a rumor carried on the wind. I was at a cafe meeting with a potential new fabric supplier, discussing the merits of organic cotton, when my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a tag on a Facebook post from a distant cousin. The post was a link to a local business journal article. The headline was blunt. Local tech startup Connectiverse folds after failing to secure second-round funding. Connectiverse. That was the name of Nolan's latest greatest venture, the one he'd been boasting about at his engagement party. I clicked the link, a knot of something I couldn't quite name tightening in my stomach. It wasn't joy. It was more like the grim, quiet feeling of watching a predictable ending finally unfold. The article was brutal. It detailed a history of mismanagement, of overspending on frivolous office perks, and a fundamental failure to create a viable product. It mentioned the initial generous seed funding from family, and how that well had now run dry. My brother, the future CEO, had crashed and burned once again, but this time, he'd done it on a much bigger, more public scale. I closed the article and went back to my meeting, but the news lingered in the back of my mind. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were reading about a stranger. The Nolan in that article, arrogant, reckless, entitled, was the brother I knew. The failure was the outcome I had always expected. The only surprise was that it had taken this long. A few weeks passed. The silence from my family was deafening. I knew they must be in panic mode, but my phone remained quiet. They were circling the wagons, protecting their golden boy from the fallout. It was during this period of quiet that my own world reached a new peak. Vogue Business, the industry bible for the business of fashion, reached out to me. They wanted to do a feature on emerging sustainable fashion labels. They wanted to feature Brooks & Thread. The interview and photo shoot were a surreal experience. A writer asked me detailed questions about my business model, my supply chain, and my design philosophy. A photographer took pictures of me in my studio, surrounded by my work. I was so used to living in the shadows that being seen, truly seen for my work and my vision, felt both terrifying and deeply validating. When the article came out, it was more than I could have ever hoped for. It was a full-page feature with a headline that made me cry. The Quiet Revolutionary, How Eden Brooks is Building a Fashion Empire on Ethics and Elegance. They called my work a masterclass in understated power. They praised my business acumen, my resilience, my clear-eyed vision. The article didn't just mention my success. It celebrated the very qualities my family had always dismissed as weaknesses: my quiet nature, my thoughtful approach, my sensitivity. The feature in Vogue Business changed the scale of everything. The boutiques that had been hesitant to work with me were now calling me. We were getting international press. I had to hire 3 more people just to handle the logistics. I was standing in my bustling studio one afternoon, approving final samples for our new collection, when my phone rang. The caller ID read Mom. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped into my small office and closed the door. I took a deep breath and answered, "Hi, Mom. Eden." "Darling, I was just thinking of you," she said. Her voice was different. It wasn't the usual flat, dutiful tone. It was warm, effervescent, and utterly fake. It was the voice she used with her friends from the country club. It was her syrupy voice. "We haven't talked in ages. I'm so sorry, things have just been so hectic here." "I'm sure they have been," I said, my voice neutral. "We saw the article, darling," she gushed. "In that magazine, Vogue. Your father and I were just blown away. We had no idea. Why didn't you tell us you were doing so well? We are just bursting with pride. A fashion empire." My goodness, I said nothing. I just listened to her empty, retroactive pride. She had no idea. Of course she had no idea. She had never asked. She had never cared to look. It's just incredible, she continued, the fake enthusiasm starting to wear thin. To build something like that, all by yourself, it just goes to show you always had that Brooks determination in you, just like your father and your brother. And there it was, the pivot. The mention of his name hung in the air between us. Speaking of Nolan, she said, her voice dropping into a more serious, confidential tone. He's been going through a bit of a rough patch. That business, it was so promising, but the market is just so fickle. It's been very hard on him. And on your father and me? We've had to mortgage the house to help him sort things out. She paused, waiting for my reaction. I gave her silence. I imagined her in her perfect living room, twisting the phone cord, planning her next move. The thing is, darling, she said, her voice now turning syrupy sweet with a hint of desperation. You're so successful now. You clearly have such a brilliant mind for business. We were thinking, maybe you could lend Nolan some advice. He respects you so much, or maybe, I know this is a lot to ask, but with things being so tight for us, maybe you could help him with a little funding, just to get him back on his feet. A family investment. The audacity of it was breathtaking. After years of dismissal, of insults, of being told I wasn't worthy of a few $100s, they were now asking me to fund the very person whose failures they had bankrolled at my expense. They weren't proud of me. They saw me as their new bank, a solution to their Nolan-sized problem. A strange calm washed over me. The anger I had held onto for so long had burned away, leaving something clean and hard in its place. I had all the power now. I held the phone to my ear and smiled. A real, genuine smile. Funny, I said, my voice quiet but perfectly clear. I was told I didn't deserve help. I let the words sit in the silence for a long moment. I could hear her sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. I'd hate to ruin your honesty, I added, and then I gently hung up the phone. The silence in my office was absolute. I had not yelled. I had not cried. I had simply returned the verdict they had given me all those years ago, and it felt like freedom. My mother's phone call was a declaration of war. A war for my resources, for my success, which they now saw as a potential family asset. But I had no intention of fighting on their terms. After I hung up on her, I expected a barrage of angry calls or guilt-laden texts. Instead, a week of tense silence followed. Then an invitation arrived. It came via a formal email from my father. Eden, it began, stiff and unfamiliar. Your mother and I would like to take you out to dinner on Saturday night to reconnect and properly celebrate your wonderful success. We have made a reservation at the Grove at 8 p.m. Nolan will be joining us. We hope you can make it. The Grove. It was one of the most expensive and exclusive restaurants in the city. A place they went for major anniversaries and business celebrations. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a strategic maneuver. They were trying to lure me back onto their territory, to use the trappings of their world, of wealth and fine dining, to remind me where I came from, who they were. They thought they could impress me, soften me, and then make their pitch again. A year ago, an invitation like this would have filled me with anxiety. I would have agonized over what to wear, what to say, how to act. But now I felt nothing but a cool sense of clarity. They wanted to see the successful Eden Brooks. I would show her to them. I replied to the email with a simple, I look forward to it. On Saturday night, I did not dress to blend in. I dressed for battle. I chose an outfit from my own label's upcoming collection. It was a tailored suit, a pair of wide-leg trousers and a matching blazer, all in a stark, beautiful ivory. The fabric was a heavy, luxurious wool-silk blend that draped perfectly. Underneath, I wore a simple silk shell. The lines of the suit were clean, powerful, and unapologetic. It was the armor I had designed for the woman I had become. I didn't wear much makeup or jewelry. I didn't need to. The suit was the statement. I drove myself to the restaurant. I didn't take my old Honda. I took a new, modest but reliable car that I had bought with my own money. I handed the keys to the valet and walked into the restaurant. The hostess led me to their table. It was in a secluded corner, a plush booth overlooking the city lights. They were all there already, looking awkward and out of place in their own chosen setting. My arrival silenced them. My father, who had been halfway out of his seat to greet me, froze. My mother's polite smile was fixed, but her eyes widened as she took in my suit. Nolan just stared, his usual smugness replaced by a look of open-mouthed shock. I was no longer the quiet girl in the homemade blouse. I was a woman who commanded attention without saying a word. Eden, my father finally managed to say, gesturing for me to sit. You look stunning. Thank you, father, I said, sliding into the booth opposite them. The ivory of my suit was a stark contrast to the dark wood and leather of the restaurant. This is a beautiful place. The dinner that followed was a masterclass in awkwardness. My parents, who had never before shown any interest in the specifics of my life, were now desperate for details. They asked about my studio, my employees, my revenue. Their questions were clumsy, revealing how little they understood about my world. They were like tourists trying to speak a foreign language, getting all the intonations wrong. I answered their questions politely, concisely, giving them facts but no emotion. I was a CEO reporting to a board of investors I had no intention of taking on. Nolan was the most transparent. After a few glasses of expensive wine, his desperation began to show. He tried to act charming, to reestablish the old, easy rapport we'd never actually had. "You know, Eden," he said, leaning forward conspiratorially, "I've been thinking. You've got the design and production side locked down. I've got the vision for tech and marketing. We could be an unstoppable team, a real family business collaboration. Brooks and Brooks. It has a great ring to it," he was pitching me. At this transparently manipulative dinner, he was actually pitching me to save him. He was asking me to hand over a piece of the empire I had bled for, to prop up the brother who had smirked as our parents declared me worthless. I looked at him, at his hopeful, entitled face, and I felt nothing but a profound sense of pity. He still didn't get it. He still thought his name and his so-called vision were assets. He had no idea that his entire life had been a liability, paid for by others. "I'm not looking for partners right now, Nolan," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "My brand's vision is already set." His face fell. My parents exchanged a look of panicked disappointment. The main event of the evening had failed. The rest of the meal passed in a strained, miserable silence, punctuated only by the clinking of silverware. When the waiter came with the check, placing it discreetly in the center of the table, my father automatically reached for it, as he had at every family dinner for my entire life. But my hand was faster. I placed my own credit card, a black corporate card with the name Brooks and Thread embossed on it, on top of the bill before he could touch it. He looked at me, confused. "Eden, what are you doing?" "I'll take care of it." "It's already taken care of," I said, looking him directly in the eye. I then looked at my mother and at my brother. I gave them a small, calm smile. "Consider it repayment for all the lessons you taught me." The double meaning hung in the air, thick and heavy. Repayment for the dinners they had bought me, yes, but also repayment for the most important lesson of all, the one about not deserving help, the one that had forced me to become my own savior. My father's hand dropped from the check. My mother's face was pale. Nolan just stared at the black card on the table as if it were a weapon. No one said a word. The silence in that expensive restaurant, the silence I had just purchased, was heavier and more valuable than gold. I signed the bill, stood up, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving them to sit in the quiet wreckage of their own making. A few months passed after that disastrous dinner. I didn't hear from them, and I didn't reach out. I poured myself back into my work, a world where I had control, where everything made sense. I opened my first flagship boutique. It wasn't in a flashy mall, but on a quiet, tree-lined street in a historic part of the city. The space was a physical manifestation of my brand, minimalist and warm, with clean lines, natural wood, and soft lighting. Racks of my clothes were displayed not as products, but as art. The boutique was my sanctuary, a place of peace and strength that I had built from nothing. I was in the back office one Tuesday afternoon, reviewing sketches for the spring collection, when one of my employees, a bright young woman named Chloe, knocked on the door. "Eden," she said, looking a little nervous. "There's a man here to see you. He says he's your father." My whole body went rigid. I had never mixed my two worlds. My family had never set foot in my studio, let alone a store with my name on the front. Him showing up here felt like a trespass, an invasion of my sacred space. For a moment, I considered telling Chloe to say I wasn't there, but I knew that would only be delaying the inevitable. This was a confrontation that had to happen. "It's okay, Chloe," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Send him in." I stood up and walked out into the main showroom, my arms crossed over my chest, a defensive posture I didn't even realize I was taking. He was standing near the front of the store, looking utterly lost. He seemed to have shrunk. In my memory, my father was a giant, a booming, formidable presence who filled every room. But here, in my space, surrounded by my success, he just looked like an old man. His expensive suit seemed a little too big for him. His shoulders were slumped, and his eyes darted around the store, taking in the quiet elegance of it all. He looked smaller, older, and deeply uncomfortable. He saw me and took a tentative step forward. "Eden," he said, his voice raspy. "Hello, father," I replied. I did not move toward him. I let him cross the space between us. He stopped a few feet away, looking at me, then around the boutique again. This place, it's beautiful, he said. It sounded like a genuine admission, not a platitude. Thank you, I said. Is there something I can help you with? I kept my tone professional, the way I would with any customer who had wandered in. He flinched at my coolness. I wanted to talk to you, he stammered. Your mother doesn't know I'm here. This is just from me. He took a deep breath, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't pride or disappointment. It was shame. That dinner, he started, then trailed off, shaking his head. We handled that all wrong. We've handled everything wrong. For years, he finally met my gaze, and his eyes were watery. I came here to say, I was wrong. We were wrong. About you. I just stood there, listening, my arms still crossed. I had imagined this moment so many times. I thought I would feel a rush of triumph, a desire to make him pay for every slight, every dismissal, but all I felt was a profound, weary sadness. We thought we were protecting you, he continued, his voice cracking. We thought you were this fragile thing, and that Nolan was the strong one, the one who could handle the world. We pushed him forward, gave him everything, because we thought he needed it to succeed. And we held you back because we thought you needed it to survive. We were so busy looking at the son we wanted to build that we never saw the daughter who was building herself. You did all this? Everything, he said, gesturing around the store, with nothing from us. No help, no support. You built everything yourself. The words I had longed to hear my entire life were finally being said. But they didn't heal the old wounds. They just confirmed that the wounds had been real all along. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a check. He held it out to me. I went to the bank, he said. I undid what I could. I want you to have this, to make things right. I looked at the check in his trembling hand. It was made out to me, Eden Brooks. The amount was for $90,000. The exact sum he had given Nolan at the dining room table. The number that had started this all. It was a grand gesture. An attempt to balance the scales, to buy his way back into my life, to erase the past with the same tool he had used to wound me. Money. I looked from the check back to his face. He was waiting, hoping I would take it, that this transaction would grant him forgiveness. Slowly, I uncrossed my arms. I reached out and took the check from him. I held it in my hands for a moment. Then I folded it once, neatly, and held it back out to him. He looked at me, his face a mask of confusion. Eden? You don't need to make things right, I said, my voice quiet but firm. You already did, he frowned, not understanding. What do you mean? You already gave me the most valuable thing you ever could have, I explained, pushing the check back into his hand. That day at the dinner table, when you told me I didn't deserve help, you taught me the most important lesson of my life, that no one was coming to save me. You taught me that I had to be my own hero, that my validation, my success, and my worth had to come from me, not from you. Your rejection was the fire that forged me. Your disbelief was the fuel I needed. You didn't fund my business, but you did create its founder. So, thank you. He stared at me, the folded check still in his hand, his eyes wide with a dawning, painful understanding. I had taken his greatest insult and turned it into my origin story. I had taken his rejection and reframed it as a gift. I had taken away his power to hurt me ever again, because I no longer needed anything from him. Not his money, not his approval, and not even his apology. He simply nodded, unable to speak. He put the check back in his pocket. I understand, he whispered. We parted peacefully. He walked out of my store and I watched him go. The forgiveness I felt wasn't a grand, tearful reunion. It was a quiet, firm release. I was letting go of the anger, not for him, but for me. I was closing the door on the past, not by erasing it, but by accepting it for what it was. I was finally completely free. I'm sitting in my office now. It's on the top floor of the building that houses my main studio and headquarters. One wall is a sheet of glass overlooking the city skyline. The lights are just starting to come on as the sun sets, a sprawling galaxy of possibilities. They gave my brother $90,000 and told me I didn't deserve help. They were right about one thing. Help didn't make me. Hunger did. The hunger to be seen. The hunger to create. The hunger to prove that my quiet strength was more powerful than his loud ambition ever was. My father's apology was the end of their story. My forgiveness was the beginning of mine. I still have a family. It's a distant, complicated relationship, built on new, healthier boundaries. There are no grand reconciliations, just a quiet, respectful peace. They finally see me, but it no longer matters in the way it once did. I learned to see myself first. My closing reflection is this. Revenge doesn't have to be a loud, explosive thing. You don't have to burn down their houses or ruin their lives. Sometimes the greatest revenge is just building your own life, on your own terms, into something so beautiful and strong that their opinions can no longer reach you. Sometimes it's a business card with your name on it, a key to a door that is only yours, or a quiet smile in a moment of triumph that no one else understands. If you've ever been told you're not enough, prove them wrong in silence. Then let your success do the talking. Hit subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by family. And tell me, what would you have done if you were Eden?